the Radio Today podcast with Jen Seyderhelm.
Hi and welcome. This episode is a GfK Radio 360 Survey 4 roundup. It was an uncomfortable one for Ahern in Sydney and Melbourne, a good one for Nova Entertainment pretty much everywhere, and a debut for Bunnings Tradio on DAB+. Survey 4 was measured from Sunday, April 19 to Saturday, June 27. In Sydney first, and let's start with the positives. Smooth was number one station overall, and Bogart Torelli edged closer to 2GB's Ben Fordham on breakfast. Sports stations SEN 1170 and Sky Sports Radio had the biggest percentage gains for their breakfast shows, and Triple M continued its consistent upwards trend. However, it was hard to find positives for ARN. KISS 106.5 breakfast has dropped from top FM to equal third with the ABC on breakfast and equal with Triple M now overall. Things were worse for Gold 101.7. The station dropped the most, and Christian O'Connell dropped to a 6.6% audience share 10+. However, this was off the back of an improvement in Survey 3, so perhaps this one's an anomaly. I will say that the losses extended to Melbourne too. Christian was down 1.3% there to now be fourth in breakfast. The station dropped 0.7. Strangely, Smooth dropped there as well. Mike Perso was up on breakfast, but the station itself has been heading downwards in Melbourne, but up in Sydney. It's similar for 2GB and 3AW. When Ben has a good one, Ross and Russ don't, and vice versa. So Ben was down this time, and Ross and Russ were up 1% to a seriously impressive 20.1% audience in Melbourne. Nova 100's Jace, Lauren and Clint were up 1% as well to 10.4%, and second, Fifi, Fev and Nick were also up 0.5 at the Fox FM to 10% and third. The other result of particular note was SEN 1116's 6.3% on breakfast. Slowly and steadily, the station and Kane and Kingy, Gary and Tim have built in Melbourne and are now above the local ABC and equal with Triple M. That is a record for SEN in breakfast, also perhaps assisted by the Socceroos. Brisbane, and this was a result that ARN could be happy with KISS 97.3 the most improved, and Robin, Corey and Kip up to second behind B105's Stav, Abby and Matt, who consolidated their lead and shared number one overall with Triple M. Triple M suffered the biggest losses, and I wonder if that's because their AFL and NRL teams are having a poor season after premiership wins last year. This was perhaps the worst result on record for 4BC, down to just a 3.3% audience 10+. Barbecue Bob was up again on 4BH to 11.3, which was a new record for him too. In Adelaide, it was an exceptional survey for 5AA, but not for the ABC. David and Will on breakfast were up 2.5% to very nearly pinch number one from Rue, Ditz and Loz at Triple M, but they were up 1.9% too, and that station clear number one in the city. And Perth, it was the biggest gains for the number one station, Nova 93.7, and its breakfast team. Mix 94.5 fell back and to third overall behind Gold 96 FM. Talk suffered with 6PR and the ABC down, particularly on breakfast. Before I get to the Cumes and DAB+, Steve Ahern caught up with networks about their results. Firstly, Tapt Media National Content Manager Greg Byrnes.
Morning, Steve. Really strong results for Sydney and Melbourne, for us. Consistent dominance across the board and in key shifts in those markets. On 3AW, Cume and TSL up, increases right across the station on 3AW. Ross and Russ in breakfast, back over a 20 share. That is extraordinary. Commercial streaming in breakfast at almost 50%. AW is by far Melbourne's most listened to radio station. In Sydney, Ben Fordham, clear number one in breakfast, just shy of a 15 share. Commercial streaming for Ben over 44%. and also a big increase for Survey 3, and year on year for Mark Levy in mornings. So really pleased to see.
A tough day at the office for Ahern Director of Content Metro Radio, Dave Cameron.
Yeah, I think it's always tough in transition. When you've got new shows and new brands, you're going to have bumps along the way, and a couple of bumps today, but not unsurprising. Not unsurprising with shows that have only been into some markets for a couple of months. You know, other shows that have sat as breakfast shows now sitting in drive, other brands that have changed their overall brand. I mean, a lot of these changes were made, all at the same time, and along with that comes sometimes bumps at the same time as well. So today, yes, absolutely a few bumps, but nothing unsurprising, to be honest, when you're building a content strategy for the future.
An encouraging day for certain of the ABC stations, says ABC Director of Audio Ben Latimer.
Look, it's encouraging news for the ABC today. We're seeing our strongest market gains in both Sydney and Melbourne, with 702 and 774 recording the biggest share increases today in their respective markets. So I think what's particularly pleasing about that is the growth we're seeing is broad-based, so it's happening across the schedule, which is a positive. It suggests that audiences are responding to the investment we've been making in local radio. We've been really focused on making our stations more relevant, more connected to their communities. So I think today's results, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, suggest that we're heading in the right direction.
A little extra bit of trivia. The ABC has edged ahead of ARN to become the number 3 network overall this survey. ACE Radio Network Metro Content Director John Vertigan had this to say.
4BH in Brisbane's still a very good story for us. Number 1 on the weekends, number 1 25 plus. Barbecue Bob had a nice lift, and we're number 1 in streaming. We're very preachy when it comes to streaming and DAB, so nice that the Brisbane listeners are getting the message there and streaming us. In Sydney, well, we're a little bit disappointed about TU. We had a fair bit of momentum, we thought, leading into this survey. Yeah, we did lift Cume, but drop in TSL, which meant that our share dropped overall. And in Melbourne, Magic stayed reasonably static, and 3MP had a slight dip as well. So just under a million unique listeners across the East Coast. We'd love to get that back over the million into Survey 5.
And finally, a largely positive day for SCA, says Head of Broadcast Content Matthew O'Reilly.
We, as you would know, don't tend to look survey to survey, but more at the trends across the year. And I guess some of the trends we're seeing is that we're increasing our gap with that 25 to 54 audience compared to our competitors across this year. And then specifically today, we see 3 stations with number 1 25-54s for us, that in Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. In Brisbane, we've got the number 1 and 2 station, which is just a great town for SCA. And then I know everyone has an interest in Sydney, but sort of our combined station share there across this year, it was an 8.9%, 25-54 back in Survey 7. It's 12.5 today, which is 40% increase. So that's all heading in the right direction. We're very pleased with the results of Triple M Sydney today. 5 surveys in a row up for that breakfast show. Highest station share since 2016. Highest Cume for the breakfast show since 2005. So we think that one's heading in the right direction. And the other one that we're really proud of today is Fox, which has had a great result in breakfast and very, very close to the number 1 breakfast show.
Cumulative audiences. The results for Nova Entertainment should be celebrated. They have the largest listening audience in Sydney for Smooth 95.3, followed by Nova 96.9, in Melbourne for Nova 100, in Perth for Nova 93.7, and even in Adelaide for Nova 91.9. The only city where they aren't number 1 for Cume audience is Brisbane. Breakfast. They hold 4 of the top 5 largest listening audiences in the country for Jason Lauren and Clint, Bogart Torelli on Smooth Sydney, Ricky Lee and Tim on Nova 969, and at 5th, Mike Perso on Smooth 91.5 in Melbourne. The 140,000 gain in Nova 100 station Cume audience is quite remarkable. People are drifting away from ARN in Sydney and Melbourne. KISS saw more than 100k losses, 75k in Sydney alone, but Gold's losses were surprisingly worse. 70,000 in Sydney, 65,000 in Melbourne. Christian O'Connell's audience across both dropped more than 70k. 3AW's Ross and Russ saw cum gain as well as percentage gain, and they, 2GB's Ben Fordham and Triple M Sydney and Melbourne are all starting to threaten ARN's numbers. So that SCA doesn't get forgotten, Fifi, Fev and Nick and the Fox FM in Melbourne were the only things between Nova Entertainment and a clean sweep of the top 5. As mentioned, Triple M Sydney and Melbourne are building and could overtake KISS stations in Survey 5. ABC Melbourne was much improved, as was SEN 1116, further building on Survey 3. The only station to really take a cum audience hit in Melbourne was Gold 104.3. Smooth Sydney was number 1 most listened to overall. Nova 100's Jason Lauren, the most listened to breakfast show. Finally to DAB+, and there was a fair bit to see without a lot of change. Cater was top in Sydney for ARN, Dance Hits for SCA in Melbourne, and Smooth FM for Nova Entertainment in Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth, as per Survey 3. Bunnings Tradio, a partnership between SEN and Bunnings, launched and is now available on DAB+ in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. For a first outing, it was a pretty solid effort, structurally sound, as a tradie might say. 65,000 cum audience across the 3 cities. SCA's Heart and Heart Hits, which were also launched late last year to compete with Smooth, are also building, Heart Hits more so. The most significant detail from DAB+ cum audience in Survey 4 is how much Sydney is embracing it. There's some 250,000 additional listeners from this time last year. Melbourne is not up quite as much and the other cities not at all. This suggests that not only are listeners who might have chosen Jonesy and Amanda or Kyle and Jackie O last year scanning the regular radio dial, they're checking out their DAB+ options too. And that'll do for Survey 4. Thanks for joining me. I'll catch you next time.
Radio Today with Jen Seyderhelm. Find more at radiotoday.com.au.
radiotoday.com.au